I would like to begin our discussion by recognizing the traditional custodians of this land. Here in Sydney, where Jared and I are currently sitting, we are on the land of the Gadigal people. Their sovereignty, as with all Aboriginal people in Australia, was never ceded. It was taken. I would also like to recognize the traditional custodians of the land that our distant participants are currently on as well. In Adelaide, South Australia, where Christopher Wilson will soon be joining us from. The university is on the lands of the Kaurna people. In Melbourne, where La Trobe University is, and from where Ruth Gamble is joining us, is on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. In Houston, where Rice University is, and from where Cin-Ty Lee is joining us, is on the land of the Akokisa and the Karankawa. Not only is this discussion taking place on unceded territory, but also with material from unceded land. The bricks and mortar and stone that make the very buildings we are in are often mined and quarried and then shipped from those lands. This is particularly stark here in Sydney. In the old banks and government buildings in the historic center of the city, many of the magnificent sandstone and granite walls were also quarried from Aboriginal land. The plinths of historic statues that often narrate the colonial history of the city were also often quarried from Aboriginal land. Indigenous land is not just lived on, it is lived with. Among us, in the walls of our buildings, tile floors and paving stones that line the streets. This brings us to geology for perhaps obvious reasons. The first reason is that geology is land. Because of this, geology is inseparable from histories and ongoing processes of dispossession and colonization. Geology is also material. It is stone and brick, lime and sand, metals and fuel. Geology is what society is made of. But geology is also stories. It is stories about the earth, how it came to be, and what it is made of. The geological sciences matter for this reason because the stories they tell shape how we understand the earth. Since the 19th century, the geological sciences have contributed to secularization, the theory of evolution, the concept of deep time and an earth billions of years old, and the theory of plate tectonics, all of which many of us now take for granted as orthodox descriptions of the world. But the geological sciences are also implicated in the world expansion of carbon-based capitalism, anthropogenic climate change, and the ongoing devastation of mining and colonialism. It is a fraught legacy, to say the least. In the New Earth Histories Research Group, we are interested in engaging with these difficult stories. Contrary to what the title might suggest, we are not interested in finding new Earth. Instead, we are interested in expanding the narratives we tell about Earth and how it came to be. This means facing the difficult colonial legacies of the geological sciences. But it also means understanding that the geological sciences have never only been Western. There are multiple traditions of geology, multiple stories of the Earth. Exploring these stories, we hope, is one step towards decolonizing geology. For our roundtable discussion, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Ruth Gamble, lecturer in the Department of Archeology and History at La Trobe University. Ruth is a scholar of medieval Tibetan Buddhism and author of the third Karmapa Banjung Dorje, Master of Mahamudra. Ruth also works on the political environmental conflicts in the Himalaya, where there are, as we speak, and we will get into later, conflicts between Chinese and Indian states. Professor Cin-Ty Lee is professor in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Rice University. Cin-Ty is the author or co-author of 151 papers, which is shocking to those of us in the humanities, published geology and earth sciences, including one filed patent, I might note, and as well, Cin-Ty is an active birder and painter. And in this vein, he co-authored The Natural History of the Galapagos Islands in 2009. Dr. Christopher Wilson, who will be joining us later, is senior lecturer at Flinders University in Adelaide in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. Chris is an archaeologist working on the archaeology of the Ngarrindjeri, the traditional custodians of the Lower Murray River. Chris's work on Aboriginal archaeology has been published in Nature and The Conversation, and he is the first Indigenous Australian to be awarded a PhD in archaeology. Ruth, can you tell us how you came to work in the Himalaya?
Yes, I was a snowboarder and I did snowboarding, and I was also really interested in meditation. So I went to stay in the Himalaya, and then I got really interested in the languages and ended up working as an interpreter. And that led me to do another degree in Asian studies. And then I did a honours degree and a PhD at ANU. In that, I realized, I guess through snowboard and skateboard training, that I was looking at the earth a lot. And so I looked at Tibetan history, but mainly at its sacred geography and the relationship between that, how that's ideas of sacred geography and the tradition of reincarnation lineages came together. And then from that, I got more interested in the earth and the water, and I'm just finishing up a project on the rivers, the major river on the Tibetan plateau, the Yalwan Tsampo. So yeah, it's a non-linear story.
How much time have you been spending there? When did you start going?
I started in almost 20 years ago. To go there when I first went there to learn the languages, and I was there for a while learning languages and interpreting, and then did lots of things part-time while I was working to get to this stage. So it's been quite a while. Yeah.
Cin-Ty, what led you to geology?
Well, when I was growing up as a kid, I was really mostly interested in just anything nature, particularly looking for animals, birds, reptiles. And then, when you start to look for animals, you have to figure out where they live, their habitats, the vegetation. Then you start thinking about topography, elevation, soil type, and pretty soon you're really thinking about geology, because that sets the environment around which life is. So as I would go out, I just saw so many neat landscapes, rocks, and and I was lucky to have access to people who are interested in rocks too. So that's how I ended up in geology.
Did you study geology or did you study earth sciences?
Well, gosh, I mean, I see those actually as the same thing. Geology is more an old-fashioned term, but my degree is in geology, but I study geochemistry, geophysics, and so it's the kind of a broad view of the earth. So I look at them at the same thing.
Thank you. Ruth, can you tell us who Ranjung Dorje was?
Yes, I can tell you when I unmute myself. So Ranjung Dorje was the first, and he lived in the 1200s to 1300s. He was a Tibetan man who came from a very poor background, who was recognized as the reincarnation of a previous teacher, and went on to be the guru or the teacher of the last Mongol emperor. Right, so he had this incredible trajectory in his life, and his story, he was the person who kind of consolidated the idea of having reincarnation lineages in Tibet. So you know how you have the Dalai Lama dies, they find a new Dalai Lama, and this has an institution associated with it and a tradition associated with it. So Ranjung Dorje was the first person to kind of set one of those up. And the reincarnation lineage he's associated with is called the Karmapas, who are still around today. Yeah, and as I said, my argument was that this was really closely linked to the sacred geography of the Himalaya. Yeah, this process.
Can you tell us how it was linked to the sacred geography of the Himalaya?
So there became this idea that that you in the Himalaya you had this idea of inheritance of land through patrilineal traditions, right? And if you had a sacred space, then there was some complexity over who could inherit a sacred space. So you basically had to be a sacred being in order to inherit a sacred space. And conversely, wherever a sacred being lived became a sacred space, right? So you had to find some way of passing that area on to become the custodian of that place. So the reincarnation traditions, they would be brought back and enthroned back in the sacred space from which the previous person had departed when they died. So there was this idea of a continuity of lineage in that place that made the place more sacred, and then living in the sacred place made the people more sacred, and the two acted symbiotically together. Yeah, that's how the connection worked. Yeah.
So the idea of reincarnation was linked to specific places in the mountains.
Not always. The idea of reincarnation is incredibly widespread. I mean, it's all through the kind of Indic religious tradition. You have reincarnation, and then it was spread through Buddhism to Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, all across the area. I mean, basic tenet of Buddhist and Hindu belief is that you go through cycles of reincarnation, which they call samsara, which isn't just a perfume, until you attain nirvana, which isn't just a band, and then you are you're out of the cycle of reincarnation. So everybody does it according to these traditions. It's just that some traditions, some beings are able to direct their lives courses so that they can be of benefit to other beings. And this is the tradition called bodhisattvas, or they're focused on other beings as opposed to themselves. And so the tradition in Tibet, where you have an institution of reincarnation as opposed to a belief in reincarnation, is associated with lineages of realized beings who are then associated with a place. Does that distinction make sense? So everybody does it, but some people do it with intent. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna talk more about reincarnation later on when we talk about deep time, because I'm really interested in how the idea of reincarnation intersects with ideas of memory and deep time, but we'll come to that. You were telling me about stories or ancient narratives that the Himalayas rose from the sea.
Yes. Yeah.
Are these do you think geological origin stories, which are also linked to stories about resources, such as the origins of water and where water comes from? Those questions can be separated.
I was just about to say the mountains are reincarnated too, some of them. So there is this idea that the mountains, pardon?
What does that mean?
So the idea is that in the Himalayan worldview, that a lot of the mountains are seen as being the abodes of, and therefore interconnected with long-lived gods. But they also go through reincarnation cycles. So there is this idea that the mountains are the abodes or the bodies of beings that kind of transition through the region too. So like Jomolungma, otherwise known as Everest, and a lot of the other mountains in the area are seen as deities that have been reincarnated as deities in order to help the beings in that space, right? So, but you get all of these different cosmologies. I don't know if I'd say geology, because I don't know, Cin-Ty can tell me this, but geology implies a focus on rocks, no? and is geology is more about the rock itself?
Well, it's about the whole history of the Earth, and rocks, kind of like the library or the books of that history.
Right. Okay. Yeah,
but not just about rocks. Yeah.
So maybe then it is, because okay, I was thinking maybe it, because I would say cosmology more than geology, because it's more of a story of how it came to be. But there is geological components in it, the book, in that they are reading these books and they find shells and pieces of coral and elements all up on the Tibetan plateau that feed into that story about how the earth it was raised up out of the sea. And then that links into Indic stories about how the earth was churned, the butter, there was a milk ocean that was churned and became butter, and the earth rose out of the sea. So you get all of these different stories, but they're all linked in together, and depending where you go in the plateau, then you'll have a different origin story or a different coming into being story. But there's very much a kind of a geological component of it, because the way that the rocks manifest and in terms of fossils as well as shape informs the stories. Yeah. Does that make sense? Oh, I think it's frozen. No. Adam's
yeah,
frozen.
I think this question of, sorry, can you hear me now? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Yeah. Okay. I would like to pick up later, I think, on this relationship between geology and cosmology, because I think that contemporary geological science and earth sciences are cosmologies, but they're contemporary cosmologies.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But we can set that aside for right now. And so I'm really interested in the contemporary resonances of these sacred geographies that you're describing, and whether or not we can sort of see them at play in some of the contemporary conflicts that are happening in the Himalayas.
Yes, so you can in one aspect, in that the nationalist government in India is a Hindu nationalist government, and part of its cosmology story is that parts of the Himalaya are part of Mahabharat, or Greater India, including Mount Kailash, which is seen as one of the most sacred spaces for Hindus and Buddhists. And that's in the Himalaya, in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, what's governed as the Tibetan Autonomous Region. And I guess there's kind of a secularist nationalist cosmology in the Chinese approach to the region too, because there's this sense of the territory of the Chinese state taking on a very an almost kind of religious, I would say religious aspect, in that it has to be whole, it has to be complete. If you lose any part of it, then there's something fundamentally faulty in how it would operate, and the borders that are drawn and the way that it's incorporated the Tibetan Plateau is part of that kind of quasi-religious nationalist narrative. But they're working on very different timescales, because the Chinese state narrative tends to ignore anything that happened before the 1950s, and the nationalist Indian approach tends to be very much focused on an invented long mythological past. Yeah, so I mean, they're both mythologicals, but this one has this idea of a deep history mythology, right, where they're saying things like, you know, the internet was invented in the Vedas, and that kind of a co-opting of science into Hindu nationalist mythology. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, Twitter is in the Mahabharata, right? I think it was originally tweeted, in fact. Let's pivot to Cin-Ty. Cin-Ty, what is the origin story of the Earth from the perspective of a geologist?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I think about the origins and the stories of Earth, I think about time and change, evolution. Time is such a big deal for Earth scientists. You know, 4.5 billion years ago, we built this Earth, and it's been evolving since then. So we have to think on long time scales, and at the same time, the Earth operates on very short time scales. So, you know, the motions of the plates, which take place over millions and millions of years, but they do so kind of in little spurts, like earthquakes. that are catastrophic and happened in seconds, or as Ruth was saying, the mountains may take millions of years to build up, but they are built up in many cases by little volcanoes that have short-term catastrophic processes, and then they come down again over millions of years. But you can see them coming down by going to the rivers and seeing the water erode the mountains, landslides coming down. So I found earth scientists, that juxtaposition of these very different timescales that we have as humans a tough time grappling with. The other thing is, I had something was originally going to say, but I'm going to go with the flow now with what Ruth was talking about. The reincarnations or the cycles. The Himalayas or mountains go through these cycles. They start off at low elevations, and then the crust is pushed together through tectonic forces, and you build a mountain. And then they come down with erosion. And the funny thing is, you wait long enough, these mountains become basins, and they collect sediments. You know, water comes in, becomes an ocean basin. Sediments is where you get the shells. And then 100 million years later, they come right back up. So it's a cycle. So even though the Earth is continuously evolving, it has cycles superimposed on it, and I quite like that. And I find it interesting that you mentioned that some of the mythologies or the religions there may be influenced by what they saw in the geology. Because if you went out to Western Australia, when humans were, when we were there, the geology is completely different. There are no mountains like what we see in the Tibetan plateau. And I'm actually curious to see what happened there in terms of religions. I know very little about the religions.
So mountains are reincarnated, I think you're saying, Cin-Ty, which I think is an amazing thing to say. And something that I also see a connection between the two stories is in the Hindu conception of the birth of the cosmos, in the mixing of the milk, the originary ocean that was milk, and the churning of the milk that creates the earth. There's this idea of a kind of original profound mixing that happens that then births geology and the earth, which I think could see some resonances with contemporary geology as well. And I wanted to ask you, Cin-Ty, this continues on from that, about your recent work on the making and the breaking of continental mantles. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that work and what it is that you're trying to answer with that work, and of course, even what a mantle is for all of us who are from outside of geology.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually interested in just how continents form, and the mantle is just one part of that. I probably won't talk too much about the mantle, but just how the continents form. We take it for granted. I mean, we have continents, so that means we have land, and we can walk around on the land, and other planets don't have continents. And it's entirely possible that when Earth, early in Earth's history, when we were still that mixture that you're talking about, before it unmixed to form the oceans, the atmospheres, the continents, the ocean basins, maybe we didn't have continents and we were a water world, a big ocean world. So that's kind of why I'm interested in how continents form, and by studying that, you find yourself trying to understand a combination of tectonic forces, but also volcanism. That's one of the primary drivers for making new crust that eventually gets, and that's an unmixing process, by the way. But that then goes on to make these big piles of crust that eventually form the continents that we take for granted and walk off to the edge of them when we go to the beach. That's about it, yeah.
I was curious about the relationship between your work and the so-called real-world consequences. in what we're talking about right now, it's pretty speculative.
Yeah.
And fascinating, but do these speculations end up actually affecting, how resources are mined, or what's the connection between?
Yeah, there are. So my work is both on kind of the theoretical level, and as you said, but also there is a deep applied level. The same forces that are involved in building new crust, new continents, magmatism or volcanism, they're moving all these ingredients of our Earth, which I call elements, around. And they do some fascinating things by scavenging from large areas and putting them into a tiny spot, which we call an ore deposit. And that's what we humans will mine, because it's just Mother Nature concentrated it there, and it's economically easier to get out of. So I guess we'll come back to this later on in your questions, but part of understanding consciousness is to understand the distribution of elements around the planet. Where do they go? How do they move around? And in some sense, geologists, humans were geologists probably all the way thousands of years ago, when they were searching for certain resources to make, finding flint, for example, to make arrowheads, or more recently, or still long ago, finding coal so that they can burn things. Or then the Bronze Age, finding copper, tin. They may not realize they were geologists, but they were looking at the Earth, looking at patterns and connections, and using the human creativity to unravel that mystery. And we are still doing that. And of course, we now understand those processes a lot better.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a good time to talk a little bit more about how we do understand those processes today. There was recently Rio Tinto, the mining giant, destroyed an Aboriginal site in the Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara here in Australia, and it was this ancient archaeological site that the company annihilated while it was mining for iron. And I wondered if you could let us know what iron is and how it's mined.
Yeah, so in order to sustain our society, no matter whether you're on the carbon-based economy or renewables, we need natural resources, and we can talk about some other ones later. But iron, well, it's used to make steel. As long as we want to keep growing our economies, you have no choice but to look for iron. The problem with geology is it's not fair to all the countries. It depends on how the land on which people live was formed, and that dictates what resources you're actually endowed with. And iron is a funny one, because most of the iron deposits in the world that are economic, they are all deposits that are about 2.5 billion years old. It's very old. And the reason for that is they formed during a time when we didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere, free oxygen. And we take it for granted that we got 20% oxygen in the atmosphere, but for most of Earth's history, you had nothing. We couldn't live 2.5 billion years ago. So there wasn't any, and that does something funny to iron that changes what we call its oxidation state. And so it can behave differently, and it gets concentrated in the oceans and builds up to a high concentration, allowing you to eventually generate layers and layers of iron-rich sediment. So the irons, they're called banded iron formations. They are sediments. You're probably familiar with sandstone sediments, but these are chemical sediments. It was like a snowfall of iron dropping out of the upper ocean and onto the bottom of the ocean, just blanketing it there. And they're only 2.5 billion years old. So you have to go to the oldest parts of the Earth to find these, and there aren't that many. And Western Australia happens to be one of the few places that have, we call them cratons, 2-3 billion year old rocks. Actually, the oldest rocks, well, the oldest rocks are probably in Greenland, but certainly the oldest minerals are out there in Western Australia. So that's where they're out there. And then the problem is with these banded iron formations, you want to get the iron out. The rock is not pure iron; it's 30% iron. So you have to. It's an open pit mine. It's a strip mine, and and that's the cost. That's the damage that you incur when you have to mine iron to support the economy. And because they're strip mines, you will destroy the land, which is destroy the habitats, the ecosystems, destroy any history that was there by the indigenous people. So yeah, it's a complex problem. We need it, but we also destroy.
Thank you. I hear that Chris is in. He should be in a little bit. Hi, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late.
It's okay. Can you hear us okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Cin-Ty was just describing how iron is created, and we were talking about the disaster with the Rio Tinto situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you wanted to jump in on that, give a kind of picture of what the destruction of that site means for people.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so hi everyone, and so my name's Chris. I'm Ngarrindjeri in Ghana. I'm based here in Adelaide on Ghana country, and yeah, thanks Adam for inviting me to be part of this today. So I guess I don't know a lot about the Pilbara. That's not where I've worked, but in terms of that relationship between mining companies and Indigenous communities, it's a long-standing issue. You know, in our discipline in particular, around the way that people work collaboratively with Aboriginal communities. I guess, you know, the collaboration aspect of you know, how you work with communities is something which is also debated, because, I mean, what level of collaboration do you actually engage Indigenous people when protecting heritage, or when researching heritage, or when looking to access sites, like in this case with Rio Tinto for mining and for, you know, resource purposes and mining minerals and so forth. So it's been a long-standing issue in the discipline. You know, what happened at Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara was one, you know, which was just, you know, gobsmacking and really disrespectful in terms of, you know, what actually occurred, but also the timing of when it occurred. So there are a few issues, you know, with the way in which, you know, Rio Tinto, you know, undertook their mining exploration and the blasting of particular sites. You know, I guess it occurred just before Reconciliation Week. So the timing of it was one thing. But there's also, you know, the matters of legislation and protection of Aboriginal sites, you know, which I guess we all kind of deal with. So in this particular case, I understand that, you know, there was permission given by the minister, and many of the states have their own policies and legislation for it. But I guess under the Act, you can, under the Heritage Acts of each state, you can apply for, you know, permission, you know, to access sites from the minister for, you know, that may be for research, maybe to undertake excavations, but in this case it was for mining. And this approval was given in 2012 and 2013. So we're talking 7 years ago. And so there's been some time lapse since then, and not, as we know, things change, you know, politicians change, but also communities change. And that can often get lost in terms of that approval process. So there's an issue around the legislation and the way in which communities are continuously engaged in that process. And when approval is given, what does that mean? I guess the site itself is, you know, one of the most, it's a significant site. I mean, the date for that site's 46,000 years old. That's in the Pleistocene era. as you'll understand that time frame. But it's quite a significant landscape in itself. That whole Pilbara area, it's got thousands and thousands of rock art and other sites like that. And this particular site was a cave site, and I think in 2014, Dr. Michael Slack had done some work around recording some more evidence for that place. So there's been more studies undertaken to record that evidence, and I guess it wasn't really taken into consideration at that time. So I can't really speak for the circumstances around it or what happened with the community. But so there's a few issues. I mean, one's obviously around.
Maybe Chris, if you would prefer, we could pivot actually to somewhere that's closer to home for you, which is in the Murray River. And maybe you'd like to tell us a bit about the history of the Ngarrindjeri on the river, how long they've been there, and your work there as an archaeologist.
Okay, so my work has been in the Lower Murray, looking at the archaeology in the Holocene. I guess the record there is around about 8,000 years old, kind of timing with the sea level stabilisation. But there's quite significant stories, Ngarrindjeri stories around Ngurunderi, who's a creation ancestor, who chased Pondi downstream from upriver. And so that story begins to, I guess, encapsulate some of that knowledge around the way in which landscapes are formed and particular times for that. So I guess, and I had an understanding of that growing up about Ngurunderi and about the river, about how significant it was. And so, working with elders, they, I guess, asked me to focus on the Lower Murray as an area for my PhD and not just do archaeological research, but also work with communities in recording some of those stories. So I guess being from that community as well, I had to kind of really consider my position within that, like in terms of being an archaeologist, but also as an Ngarrindjeri community member. So I was undertaking research and had to really kind of consider my ethical responsibilities in that, but also my cultural responsibilities. And I guess the example I can give around some of the complexities of that relates to legislation and heritage legislation. So when undertaking excavations in this state, I had to apply for permission to undertake those, of course, under the Act and get an exemption. So I did that for my first field season, but after that particular field season, one of the elders who's now passed, Uncle Tom Javori, they had a community meeting about, my work and about me being Ngarrindjeri and about, do I actually have to apply for permission? I mean, is that something in which is actually, giving power back to the state and to that kind of colonial process? So I was advised by community members at that time to not apply for an exemption at this time. And I was quite worried because of the implications that may have in terms of my profession and, what that meant, legally. So I had to get some advice from Aboriginal Affairs and Reconciliation Division around that, around what it said in the legislation. And they came back with an interesting response, which was, it says here that, in a clause in the legislation that, Ngarrindjeri people can interact and interfere with sites if it's for that purpose of ongoing and maintaining and protecting cultural heritage. And so that took that back to the community, and they actually, through, I guess, that kind of, it's not a loophole, but I guess, the interpretation of that was that, well, I am Ngarrindjeri and I am interacting for education and research. It's to understand the cultural heritage in more depth and in more detail. And so decided not to apply to the minister for that, as a result of that. And I guess that's, an example of some of the complexities and challenges that I, have faced as an Indigenous person, but also as an archaeologist. And, I guess that process of working collaboratively and being open and transparent was the key to making sure that I was kind of protecting myself as well as protecting the community and the heritage that I was working with. And I focused on shell bins along there, but it wasn't that wasn't just the focus. It was obviously more of a, an inquiry into, the significance of undertaking archaeology for Indigenous people. So,
Thank you. And we will come back to questions of collaboration later in more detail. I wanted to circle back to Ruth and bring up this question of reincarnation again. I want to talk about deep time, and I want to understand whether deep time actually works across. There's different imaginaries of deep time across cultures, and what they mean really, and the kind of politics of deep time. So I wonder, for you, Ruth, reincarnation is a way of thinking about deep time.
Reincarnation and deep time. So the way that these are set up in, I would say, I don't know, just roughly speaking, like Indic traditions, the idea of deep time is cyclic again, like nothing's not cyclic. But you get this idea of, I was actually thinking about when Chris was talking about the settler state coming in and interfering with them. It's like, well, at least from a big time perspective, that we've only been here annoying people for a while, you know, and it seems a bit kind of, oh, it's so bad. Anyway, but within the kind of Buddhist and Hindu tradition, you have this idea of massive cycles of time, like earth forming and earth falling away, and then the earth comes back and falls away. So there is this sense then that humans within that massive cycle are quite small and insignificant. But then there's also this idea of this, the idea of reincarnation is that there's a continuum of mind that interrelates with those other cycles. So you have a cycle of a human going through from human to animal to God to back to ghosts to hell beings, going through all of these different realms, different constructions of materiality, and it just keeps going on and on and on, right? So any one experience of being a human is only one part of a continuum. And I don't have any here, but the metaphor that they often use is, you know, prayer beads, how they have the thread going through them, and then each individual bead, so that the mind is like the thread, and then the bodies are just like the beads going from one comes and goes and one comes and goes. And then this ends up being like an extended metaphor for when you look at worlds. The worlds come and go, and the continuity of mind of all of the beings is what continues while everything else comes in, comes up and comes down, comes up and comes down. And I think that there's like there's a fundamental humility in there, which again, going back to Chris's story, I felt like I was missing from the state asking him to do things. But so there's like a lack of human importance in that massive scale. Right, and everything is and there's this interesting point that Jan Natia made in this book on time scales in pre-modern Indic traditions, is that before you came up with geology, before the invention of modern science, this was one of the largest numeric, like because the Indian tradition invented zero, but then also multiplicity. So everything kept getting expanded. Anytime someone will come up with a number for the length of time, there's lots of things about this was 30,000 million years, and then they go, oh, but that was within another time cycle that was 60,000 million years, right? So it kind of gets more expanded and expanded out through time, and then through space forming and falling away within those time scales. Gosh, it's very difficult to discuss these things in a.
Sorry, it's my fault. I'm pushing you off to move quickly. It's really amazing, and I wonder too what this means for Cin-Ty, of course, because you know geologists now think on a scale of 4.5 billion years in the terms of Earth's history. And one of the things that contemporary geology is really great at is forcing us to think at these incredibly huge timescales. But then that also, I wonder, Cin-Ty, for you, there's this kind of tension between if we think at a 4.5 billion year timescale, why should we care about humans? Because we're nothing on that. So how do we shift from these massive timescales to something like the pressures of, you know, the destruction of an Aboriginal site today? So I guess politics versus deep time.
Here we go. Yeah, I guess it's an interesting question. I myself have never had a problem of thinking in deep time, but at the same time thinking on human time scales. I think they're related, but also separate questions. There's just the issue of humanity and the history that we carry, and I think I would look at a different way how we are, who we are is kind of linked to the land, both from what the resources have provided us, that includes water, soils, but also the landscapes. You know, people who in the U.S., if you grew up in Southern California, you probably, without even knowing it, have a different view of the Earth as opposed to if you grew up in the Great Plains. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question. It's kind of a weird question, but yeah. I think I might be, yeah, I could answer your question better on the reincarnation stuff and how that relates to the earth sciences there. And I think, you know, we're made out of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen.
It sounds to me like you're saying that we are geology.
Yeah, we are geology, but we're the carbon that was in us, that's in us, was built in stars, and then came together with other elements to form the Earth, and this mixture that you talk about. And the Earth has been unmixing, and the volcanoes release the carbon from deep inside the Earth to the atmosphere. That makes it into the plants, makes it into us, and then we die and we go back to the Earth, and it's a cycle. Yeah, I hope that wasn't too weird, but yeah.
Doesn't decolonizing geology imply that you need to be a bit weird?
Yes, yeah, and yeah,
I wonder if Chris might jump in here, because
yeah.
With ideas about country and whether or not you can see resonances with what Cin-Ty's talking about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Certainly. I certainly hear what Cin-Ty's talking about. And yeah, I guess I don't struggle either with that kind of thinking of deep time. It's just a way to frame it, isn't it, by calling it deep time? But I guess for you know, for me, we call land Rui or Rua, and that means body, land, and spirit. So, and those kinds of concepts, you know, for me and from what I've learned, are, you know, they're all connected. You know, as Ruth and Cin-Ty are saying that, you know, that the land is part of our body, and our body's part of that land, and our spirit's also connected within that. And I guess there is a relationship between the spirit and the cosmos and the stars in like Ngurunderi in our creation stories as well, and that there's a return back, you know, to the earth, but also to the sky, as well as part of that. So what part of the end of the story of Ngurunderi is around, you know, chasing his wives, and because his wives did wrong. And so there's this story along the river, and that goes out to the lakes and down to a place called Victor Harbour and Cape Jervis. And Cape Jervis is the kind of the port over to Kangaroo Island. And at that point in particular, that's where Ngurunderi puts his canoe up into the Milky Way and into the sky, and that creates the Milky Way. And that's where the spirit world is, you know, for Ngurunderi people, and we kind of return to that spirit world and end up in Kangaroo Island. So in Kangaroo Island is seen as the place of the dead. It's called Carter, and so archaeologists have done work there and have actually, you know, their findings have been that, you know, nobody or humans didn't occupy that area you know, or they occupied the area until about 4,000 years ago, when Backstairs Passage, you know, flooded from sea level rise. So, so there's kind of validation to some of the stories and narratives and some of that knowledge, and you know, there's so many intricate levels to what time is, and you know, of being, and of landscape and place, and you know, just working with some of the elders down in the river, like Uncle Marshall Carter, you know, told me a story on country about his birth, and he was born at a certain place, which was a granite boulder, which is part of Ngurrunderi's footprints. And so there's this connection between birthplace and granite along the river, and they're quite prominent features in the landscape and really important for Ngarrindjeri people, and seen as part of ceremony as well, particularly for men. So yeah, there's all these elements that, you know, I've kind of learnt through being on country as well, and you know, there's stories told to you when you're actually on these places, because that's the purpose of it. So some of those things aren't told through, you know, through books and through other ways, and so that's the really important aspect to land in country for, I guess, that I've learnt. So.
Amazing, thank you. I'm mindful of time. I did want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of the politics of our work, but I think maybe we can do that in the question. So if anybody would like to ask a question, can you please let us know in the chat box for an open discussion.
I could ask a question of Ruth and Chris, if that's okay.
Please, yeah.
Yeah, before you came in, Chris, Ruth was talking about how the effect of the geology in the Himalayas influenced the way people thought, because they could see way up high in the mountains. They found fossils with shells in them. So at one point, mountains were down in the oceans. They were basins, and then they rose up. And I think once someone appreciates that, it must fundamentally change their world view. But geology is so different everywhere. Like in much of Australia, Western Australia, there's nothing like that. You won't find any fossils. You don't find the really tall mountains out in Western Australia. And so does that, and I don't know, I'm just curious, does that sort of change? Do you see that in the mythologies or the way people, the early people think in their stories?
In terms of the change of landscape?
Yeah, it's just seeing, I guess, I mean, some obvious ones would be if one grows up in a tropical rainforest as opposed to a very dry desert landscape. Your view of the world, your society might be different, but also what you see in the geology, even though they're not long ago, not geologists as we know them today, but they're looking at rocks, they're looking at the landscapes. They're,
Yeah. I guess,
stop me if these are stupid questions, but
no. I mean, from you know, we know that those, you know, the creation stories and all that knowledge has been embedded in the whole oral history. All that knowledge around, like particularly if you're in the desert country, and those stories that, you know, convey important information about waterholes and certain places that are significant for survival are attached to those stories, but also other important concepts about living. So, and I guess I was kind of talking about Ngurunderi a bit of it, and Pondi, which is the Murray cod, and there's a whole bunch, in that one kind of creation story, there is so many layers, there's layers of that for kids and for children, for young people, and layers for men and women, and it's just, it becomes a really, as I've grown older, I've understood how complex that can be. So, there's certainly the, those oral histories, and that knowledge is all embedded in that story, and they describe the changes of river and of sea country and of landscapes, and we know that a lot of those seabeds are, landscapes are submerged, but there were old ocean beds where they're now deserts and stuff like that. So it's quite interesting landscapes. We know people were still occupying them at times, and then abandoning them and then coming back, thousands of years later. So there's, the archaeological evidence as well that helps to support some of this. Yeah. So there's nothing that that I've read or that kind of contradicts any of that. It all kind of supports and validates a lot of what already known or existing in the ethnography or through anthropological records or through oral histories that have been recorded even today. So yeah.
We have a question from Kai. If Kai would like to unmute themselves.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know how to phrase this question because it's a bit outside of my zone of knowledge, but it is something that I'm thinking about a lot. I guess in terms of of architectural history, and I'm thinking about the continuities between geology and stone as kind of evidence, like stone monuments, I guess, as evidence. Also the absence of monuments and how to think more fluidly about monuments and their absence as forms of history. And I guess I've been thinking about the stone of the monument and the stone of the earth as being more continuous, and how to think those together along a more fluid, with a more fluid boundary, if that makes sense. That's my question. I'm especially thinking about Tibet, but that's my question.
It's interesting because there's the Tibetan approach to monuments and rocks is based in this fundamental idea, again, of impermanence, that things are not going to stay there forever. They're continually changing. And there's even a lot of teachings that you get that are focused on the idea that that mountain will disappear, that rock will disappear. Anything that you put up is constantly changing, is constantly, there's this idea of dende or interconnectedness, so that it's only understood because you put a label on it to call it something, and the mind seeing that will change and the object will change. It's constant change. Right, so when it comes, but there's also this interesting thing in terms of monuments, because I was thinking about this. There's monuments in Tibet, the only things that they haven't been able to lock up to show that it had a more sense of independence than is being attributed to it now, that link back to the connections between it and India and China. And there's a stone monument in the middle of Lhasa that talks about boundary fences between China and Tibet and India, right? So it's a stone monument that hasn't been trashed yet. But it's linked to boundary rocks that are all around the edges of the plateau, as well as the one that's inscribed in the middle of the city. And it's almost as if it's now being encased in things so people can't see it properly, but they all know it's there. And so I don't know, again, there's this sense of rocks, it's different types of rocks being recognized for the fact that they don't disappear, And the other thing that I was thinking about in conjunction with this, because that gets back to what Cin-Ty was talking about how the world makes us, is another project I was working on is sand and sand mining, because the rivers are not just a water source, but they're also a source of soil going down to the Chinese and Indian plains. It's kind of like a mud shed as well as a watershed, delivering fertile soil to the bottom. And at the moment, it's interesting because I keep getting the sense that they're trying to stop up all of the flow and all of the movement through these areas. So they're mining the rivers and turning the sand from the rivers into concrete freeways and concrete bridges and concrete train lines. So literally fixing the sand that had been flowing in place. All right. So, and then the borders are trying to stop people moving across the passes and out of the areas, and solidifying it. So it's almost as if the state there wants to keep everything in its place, everything in a fixed space, without letting that flow that would have happened geologically through that space continually. And then so you get this weird conjunction of the old stones that won't go away. You know what I mean? That stone in the middle of Lhasa won't go away. It's hanging in there saying, at one time there was a treaty between China and Tibet. That's in the middle of the place. And then at the same time, there's monuments all around the edges. Like you go into the middle of the desert and there's these massive signs saying about how the state is helping the people. Right? So the government is looking after you, and there's a massive sign in the middle of the desert telling you this. Right, so there's this weird kind of, I think it's almost this weird, there's this constant flow of some rocks, and then there's other rocks that are just hanging in there going, we're still here, we're still here. As you know, the state's trying to kind of almost erase that history. Yeah. God, I've depressed myself. I'm turning, yeah.
With the final question, Alison, I know that you have a question, and I think that it's the question that we should ask to each of the presenters today.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? And thanks very much. It really is to get to the heart, as we start to come to the end of our conversation, to tackle the really hard question that Adam has posed for us all, and to ask you what you think decolonizing geology, quite simply, might entail for you and your work.
Who wants to go first, or are we going all around, or?
All around. Let's start with you, Cin-Ty.
Okay, yeah, so, you know, that's geology historically has a lot been on extracting natural resources, and whether one likes it or not, that is an essential evil if you want to support 7 billion people on this earth peacefully. But at the same time, we know all the damage that extracting resources can do, not just on the environment, but geopolitics, the communities that live there. But what we've seen in the field of earth sciences over, you know, the last 10, 20 years is almost everyone, all the new scientists that come in, we think about the earth really as a system, everything interconnected. And I think that's very powerful, because now at the same time, when you have companies going into mine, the new geologists should and can tell what are the impacts on the environment. And so if you want to decolonize I think the whole package has to be in there. And I think we're now thinking about climate change as well as natural resources. I think you need more than geologists and environmental scientists. You need anthropologists, social scientists to bring in the human element, but they all have to talk to each other. So I think there's promise for moving toward a more sustainable natural resource plan in the future across all countries.
Ruth?
I would say I think decolonizing geology is learning how to look at things differently, see differently, and also take some of the lessons that are actually there in geology about humans being smaller than we are, right? Or individual humans being smaller, and listen to the traditions and cultures and the people who are the knowledge holders of those cultures about longer term human histories with those places, and learn to weigh things up more evenly, getting rid of some of the obscene power distinctions that we see underpinning a lot of geological, I don't think it's actually geology, I think it's the uses of geology in a way.
Chris?
Yeah, so I guess for me, it's kind of, you know, decolonizing is, you know, really about, you know, speaking back to that colonial practice and making change, you know, for our shared futures. So for me, to be positioning, you know, at the centre of any inquiry or any practice or any research, you know, Indigenous people, whether, you know, that be, you know, as part of that particular agenda or project, or that collaboration, or going to talking, you know, to local community members. So there, you know, there are simple things that can be done to start that process. I'm sure many of you already are, but yeah, for me, it's really positioning Indigenous people at the centre of the inquiry, and making sure that, you know, that there is a focus there, you know, that supports local communities, particularly in some of these regions that seem to be abandoned landscapes or not having people within them. You know, like, you know, some of the arid zone and desert areas, but they're important and significant places and have been for Indigenous people for a long time. And there's so much knowledge there that people have about land and country and all the resources that are there. So yeah, that's yeah, it's really centering Indigenous people at that inquiry and agenda.
Well, thank you all very much, Cin-Ty, Ruth, and Chris, for Cin-Ty for staying up late for this, and everybody, all the Australians for coming out. I really appreciate it. It's been a really wonderful conversation. There's an event coming up next week, 2 weeks from now, 10 days, is Deep History White, a lecture by Pratik Chakrabarty. That will be incredible. Everybody is welcome to join. And the conversations will continue in some way, somehow. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Nice meeting you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah.